everyone, it's Jack Ballou. In this video, we are going to discuss using ground poles for rehab situations with horses. So I'm defining a rehab situation as any period following when you've healed from an injury or a prolonged period of time off, greater than 6 weeks of cessation of exercise. The reason that ground poles are so effective in rehab situations are because they pre-measure the distance for each stride. And what that does is interrupt the body's habituated patterns. In the case where a horse has had limited mobility, the body adopts ineffective patterns. So for example, commonly what will happen is an asymmetry in the front end, where one foreleg gets stronger and one foreleg becomes a little less utilized. And we won't even be able to detect it with our naked eye, but the flight of the hoof will commonly be on the dominant leg, commonly coming inward or slightly across the chest like this with every stride. And it's so small that we can't detect it. But commonly when you put that horse traveling over ground poles, they'll catch that foot on the pole and maybe trip a little bit or kind of catch their attention because the ground poles interrupt that flight of the foot. So that's one way that ground poles are incredibly beneficial. The other are the motion of, and I'm talking about just walking ground poles, the activity of walking the horse in a nice relaxed posture and state of mind, hopefully, creates a very good, because of the amplitude of the steps the horse takes as he walks across the poles, it creates a really good swing in the horse's barrel. And maybe you've heard me talk before in other videos about the intercostal muscles in horses, especially stock type horses or short barreled horses. They get very tight in their intercostal muscles, the little ones between the ribs. And when the rib cage is not free, it acts as kind of like a plug between the energy in the hind legs and the front legs. It kind of blocks that motion from coming forward. So in a well-moving horse, the rib cage should swing freely. In a horse that's been confined because of an injury, the rib cage, well, everything really just gets kind of stuck. So walking over ground poles is a terrific thing to do. I want to tell you how to space them, how to use them, and then some ideas for moving forward as you use it in a rehab program. The average horse, and this is for a horse that is about 16 hands. So you're going to adjust your spacing based on if your horse is quite a bit shorter than that or quite a bit bigger than that. But for a horse at 16 hands with about a hand on either side of this, the spacing applies. You want to space your poles counting in the middle. I go heel, toe, about a little under 3 feet between each pole for walking. Now it is important to note that when we talk about ground poles for rehab, we are talking about mostly just walking routines. When people think about cavaletti conditioning and ground pole exercises they might do in their riding lessons or around the arena, that's a whole different way to use ground poles and is highly beneficial. But what we're talking about here is how to use ground pole patterns for retraining neuromuscular patterns, for re-educating the neuromuscular system. And to do that, it's best when we're recruiting those slow twitch muscle fibers close to the spine, the ones surrounding joints, the ones that communicate directly to the central nervous system. And that happens in slow, finely controlled movements. So we've talked about your spacing. Many people ask, do I need to raise them on blocks? If you are just starting out with ground poles, I prefer you start them on the ground. I want to make sure you meet 3 criteria before you raise them up on the blocks. The first criteria, that your horse maintains a totally steady tempo approaching the poles, crossing the poles, and after the poles. So if you approach the poles with a nice brisk walk and then you get to the poles and the horse is slowing down, you're not ready to raise them up yet. The football has to stay steady like this, like a beat, okay? That's criteria 1. Criteria 2 is the horse needs to maintain the same comfy body posture, approaching the poles, crossing the poles, and after the poles. So if you're approaching the poles in a really nice, loose, horizontal balance with the ground, and then you go to step over the first pole and the horse goes like a giraffe, you're not ready to raise them up. Nothing is gained from raising them up, okay? Get the value out of doing things correctly first with them on the ground. The third criteria is they need to be totally straight. So let me show you what I mean. You want, whether you're working your horse on line, on a lunge line, or you're ground driving him, or maybe you're on top of him riding him. Either way, you want to line the horse up over the center of the poles and hold that line straight. When a horse is asymmetrical, tighter, stronger, stiffer on one side of their body, it's like your car being out of alignment. And what happens is they kind of pull to this side. See me drifting away from the camera? See how now I'm over the outside of this edge of this pole, and they end up all the way over here, drifting quite a bit from where I started. So again, if that's happening, you're not ready to raise them up yet. Keep them on the ground. Once you can meet those three criteria, speed, posture, straightness, then you can raise them up. I recommend, for the purposes of rehab, that when you raise them up, you begin by raising the alternating ends. So you can see that I've got this end of the pole raised. On the next pole, I raise the opposite ends, and then the same on these final two. That just allows the horse to have a little bit different stimulation before you would proceed to raising both ends of the pole, if you have that many risers available. If you don't have enough of these blocks, I do sell these on my website if you want to pick up a set. But if you have a limited number of blocks, just remain with alternating ends raised. That's fine. You're still getting a lot of work done. And you don't need to raise them any higher than this. 6-8 inches maximum is fine for rehab purposes. Don't think that higher and higher and higher is better. It's not necessarily. You want the horse to remain very comfy in its body. So the most basic setup, as I've shown you here, is just with poles in a single line. Once you have mastered walking over them on the ground, and then raising alternating ends, and then possibly raising both ends, and you would make each of those adjustments over the course of each week. So you would do your ground poles every day for a week on the ground. The next week you would add that next level of stimulation and raise alternating ends. Once you've done that, we don't want the horse to become robotic about things, and it's easy to then alternate the spacing between your poles, so that rather than just getting one step between each of the poles, you would, for example, double the spacing between these two poles, so the horse would have to take 2 steps before crossing the next pole, and then possibly you would triple the spacing to the next pole. So you're getting a lot more adjusting that the horse needs to make. That would be the next way that I would vary this pattern before you progress to exercises, for example, setting the poles up on a bent line where the horse has to curve his body and things like that. Another takeaway to keep in mind is many people ask, can I do walk poles every day? If you are thinking about the points I've made to this point, is this is slow controlled movement. We're not moving the horse quickly. We are not working gymnastic muscles. What you're doing is really thinking about activating and stimulating things. A general rule is when you walk your poles, go over them 20 times a day. That's enough to stimulate what you need to do, okay? You are activating the deep back muscles alongside the spine. They've proven, many different vets have proven those muscles become deactivated or decommissioned in any case of back trauma. It could be a poorly fitting saddle. It could be a strenuous workout session that really strained the horse. It can be an acute injury, obviously, but once those back muscles become decommissioned, they don't automatically switch back on once the source of pain has been resolved. Ground poles is a terrific way to reactivate those muscles, because as you're making these small movements walking over the poles, those muscles control the spinal joint placement. They kind of are constantly switching on to govern and dictate those tiny little movements that are coming through those spinal joints. So, we've talked about spacing, how to approach your pulls, the basic equipment for setting up these routines, and that you can do these as long as everything is staying slow and controlled. You can do these every day. Again, we're not talking about trotting them or cantering them or making it strenuous for the horse. This is about neuromuscular re-education for rehab purposes. So thanks for tuning in. This has been Jack Ballou talking about how to use ground poles for rehabbing horses.